All right, last week we just barely started in chapter 19, so let's just go back to where we were. Abraham had bargained with God for the souls of the people of Sodom. Primarily, he was concerned about his nephew Lot. And when that powerful exchange ended, Abraham didn't know what was going to happen. But he had good reason to be fearful. The angels that earlier had accompanied God in his visit to Abraham had gone on ahead to Sodom to see firsthand what they were dealing with. The best archaeological evidence suggests that Sodom and Gomorrah were located at the extreme southern tip of the Dead Sea in an area that is now underwater. If you look at a map of the Dead Sea, it's shaped kind of like an exaggerated kidney shape. It's wider at the top and at the bottom than it is at the middle. At the middle, it becomes very narrow. From that narrow point north, the lake is actually quite deep. From that narrow point south, it is extremely shallow. In fact, much of that lake bed in modern Israel's day has ceased to exist completely. They've got big evaporation beds where they are recovering the salt for commercial use. The salt and a number of other chemicals that are in the water. But there is definite archaeological evidence of some kind of human habitation ruins underneath that shallow part of the lake. And they believe that to be the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the angels got down there at about the end of the day. We mentioned last week the progression of Lot's corruption, the corrupting influence of Sodom and how it was affecting him. And the scripture speaks of this very powerfully. Initially, he moved his tent as far as Sodom, 13:12. Then he is described as dwelling in Sodom, 14:12. And then finally, in this passage, he's pictured as seated at the gate of Sodom in 19:1, which says Lot had truly become a Sodomite. He had become one with the people. He had apparently took a wife from among the Sodomites. There's no indication that he had a wife before he moved to Sodom, but he certainly had one when he was leaving. And so he had intermarried with this Canaanite people. He's physically and financially and emotionally invested in this place. His daughters are engaged to men from Sodom. And these apparently were among the men who would confront the angels in the city square in just a few moments. It says in verse 1, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So, at the very suggestion on the part of, again, what Lot at this point assumes is two men, that they would spend the night in the town square, Lot is quite frankly alarmed at the idea. He knows the danger of such plan. I can think of some very dangerous city parks in Chicago when I was working there back in the late 80s. And you'd have to be out of your mind to camp out in that park. It's not safe. And the town square of Sodom was definitely not safe for what appeared to be two healthy, attractive young men. And so Lot just basically grabs them by the wrist and pulls them. I mean, he is, the image here is of somebody who is going the extra mile to say, absolutely not, you must spend the night in my house. This is taking Oriental hospitality to the next level. He's not just being hospitable, he's worried about the health and safety of these men. And in verse 6, he pressed them strongly. One scholar translated, he manhandled them. We're talking arm twisting, figuratively and maybe literally. Because what Lot knew, and what he had no way of knowing that the angels already knew, was that homosexual practices had become a dominant way of life in Sodom. Now, this is behavior that later on, when the Levitical law is written, is clearly, unambiguously forbidden. It is defined very clearly as sinful. Now, we live in an age in which this has become a hot button issue in our society. And it's not for me to offer advice about what should and should not be legal under our form of government. But in terms of what is lawful under God's law, there's no ambiguity. And it's not just spelled out in the Old Testament, it's spelled out in the New. Now, as Christians, particularly when we're dealing with unbelievers, we take people where they're at, and we our responsibility is to introduce them to Jesus. And Christ saves them where they're at, not where he wants them to be. Jesus loves us enough to accept us where we are. He loves us too much to leave us where we are. So, as Christians, this is not an issue that is in some kind of gray area. And clearly what's going on in Sodom is not just homosexuality, but it is brutality, it is rape, it is violence against other people. The homosexuality in Sodom was very much a part of the Canaanite world. And it was very much wrapped up in Canaanite religious practices. It is the kind of stuff that would be a snare for Israel throughout their history. Because in the Canaanite worship, they had combined religion and sex. And it is a powerful combination. You get those two very powerful forces interwoven in one institution, and it is a force to be reckoned with. In the Baal worship and the other Canaanite worships, most of the religion consisted of fertility cults. And so everything they did was focused on trying to increase the fertility of the land, to ensure good crops, to ensure the livestock reproduced. And so, because that was their primary goal in their religion, it wasn't a big mental leap to go from the fertility of the soil and the livestock to the fertility of people. And so the intermingling of sex and religion came very easily and naturally, and it persisted for centuries. Here in Sodom, added to all that was sexual violence. And it became apparent that among the men of Sodom, they were not only homosexuals, they were bisexuals. It says all the men of the city went out into the city square and started pounding on Lot's door, demanding that he send those two young men out to them so that they could have their way with him. Now, if we're to take that literally, all of the men of the city includes the very men who are engaged to Lot's daughters. So this is what's going on here. Now, even though homosexuality and bisexuality was commonplace in the Canaanite world, the kind of violence that is described here would have been anathema in an Oriental culture in that day. You don't treat guests like this. One of the realities in the Arab world today is still very much the idea that guests are treated with hospitality. Some years back, it's been over 10 years ago now, 2003 I believe it was, 3 Southern Baptist missionaries were murdered in the city of Jibla in Yemen. Joyce and I knew one of them. It was a young woman who had spoken earlier in our church as a missionary speaker. She was a native of Milwaukee. And this was a case of martyrdom. The man who killed them went in to kill them specifically because one of these people had shared the gospel with his wife. And when this happened, a corrupt national government in Yemen, and one of the missionaries who worked in Yemen when I was there some years back, who had earlier worked in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, said Saddam Hussein was far better as a leader than the guy who was leading Yemen. To give you an idea how bad this guy was. And yet, the president of Yemen, when this happened, was absolutely horrified and went to great pains to find, try, and ultimately execute the man who killed these missionaries. And he did it not because he had any great love for missionaries. He did it not because he had any great love for medical personnel. He did it really for 2 reasons. One, he didn't want this to create problems between him and the U.S. military, but also because this was a violation of Arab hospitality. You don't treat guests in your country in such a way. And this also should help you understand when you got a group like ISIS running amok, what they're doing is every bit as offensive to the rest of the Arab world as it is to us. Because most Arabs are horrified about this for a lot of reasons, and one of them is, when you kill Western hostages like they have done, it is a violation of a primary value in the culture of hospitality. And so what the people of Sodom were trying to do to these men would have been looked upon with horror by other cities in Canaan. So we're talking about an utterly corrupt place that has really gone beyond the pale of any kind of acceptable standards of behavior. Now, one of the real mysteries of Scripture is the passage in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 6 through 9, where it reads, "If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he," speaking of God, "condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, As for that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. Now, if it were not from a couple passages, one in 2 Peter and one in Hebrews, I don't think it would ever occur to anybody to include Lot and righteous in the same sentence, because his behavior is abysmal. And 3 times Peter refers to him as righteous. He doesn't want you to miss this. Right? First of all, obviously, righteous doesn't mean perfect, because anybody can see Lot's a long ways from perfect. What we have to conclude from these New Testament insights into Lot's character is that he truly was a God-fearer. But he was a man of far less character and commitment than Abraham or Noah or some of the other great figures of faith. Even after Abraham delivered him and his fellow Sodomites from the kings of the east, Lot returned to Sodom, ultimately to sit in the city gate. You see, Lot hadn't just gone into Sodom. Sodom had gotten into Lot. There was a lot about that city that fascinated him. He liked it there. There were things that, thanks to the insights of the Apostle Peter, that shocked and horrified him, that dismayed him, that grieved him, but not enough to withdraw from it. Not enough to protect his daughters from marrying into this. Not enough to keep him from himself marrying a woman of Sodom. Lot was a conflicted soul. At the same time, he was both offended and allured by Sodom. He liked the prosperity, the comforts, the culture, the prestige. He liked sitting in the city gate as one of the decision makers, the influencers. But at the same time, he was worn down by the filthy lives of the lawless men. He was tormented by what he saw. As such, Lot has a lot of company in 21st century American Christianity. We've got an awful lot of people who truly do believe in Jesus Christ, who have committed their life to Him, but have become so enamored with some of the uglier aspects of our culture that the idea of living lives separated from the sin around them is almost inconceivable. Lot begins with sort of an act of gallantry, trying to protect these 2 visitors. But that gallantry is quickly eclipsed by an unbelievable and craven proposal. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Now, 4,000 years of history and a radically different worldview and culture notwithstanding, as a father of a daughter, I cannot in any way, shape, or form wrap my head around what would cause someone to offer up his virgin daughters to a lusty, violent mob. But that's exactly what Lot attempts to do. He's placed the sanctity of hospitality over the sanctity of his own family. What he's suggesting is a monstrous breach of his responsibilities as a father. You know, we read this and we just go away kind of shaking our head saying, what a disgusting little man. You know, there's a reason why people don't name their sons Lot. Back in 2 Peter, it says, "Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment." And it is demonstrated here. The angel's arm reached out and yanked Lot back into the house. Remember the scene. The angels, Lot's wife, his two daughters are in the house. The mob is out front. Lot steps out and closes the door behind him, and he tries to bargain with the mob. He makes this ghastly proposal that they take his daughters. At this point, the mob is so outraged that they're beginning to press in on Lot, and who knows what they're going to do to him. And at that point, an arm reaches out from behind that door, grabs him, pulls him in, and voila, the angels strike the crowd, temporarily blind. But at this point, the horror is combined with an almost element of black comedy, as these men, now struck blind, exhaust themselves trying to find the door. I mean, this is just unbelievable behavior. They've learned nothing. They're not afraid. They're just further outraged. This is a city that has used up its right to continue to exist. So the angels tell Lot, you got to get your family and get out of here because we have been sent to destroy this place. And the first thing Lot does, and this is understandable, he goes looking for his son-in-laws, or his future son-in-laws. Now, bear in mind, they apparently were out there in the crowd with the rest of them, but that notwithstanding, you know, he's looking after his daughter's interest at this point. And they just laugh him off. They think he's joking. They don't take him seriously. And so, and you know, that again, the parallels with our lives today. One of the real frustrations as we try to share the gospel with some people is the tendency for some to laugh it off. And the more depraved the person, the deeper they are into a lifestyle of sin, the more likely they are to just laugh you off. You know. And the sun is about to come up. The long, dark night of Sodom is about to come to an abrupt end. There is a common image in Scripture. We see it in Isaiah 9 and Malachi 4 and Luke chapter 1. The image of salvation coming with the sunrise. And that's what happens here. As the sun comes up, God's judgment is about to fall. The angels at this point use force as an act of mercy. Just as they reached out there and grabbed Lot and yanked him in the door, at this point they're grabbing him and trying to drag him out of town. Lot's deliverance is a divine exercise of grace, and it has nothing to do with his merit. This is unmerited grace. It's, he is the beneficiary of Abraham's prayers at this point. And so the angels have got Lot, his daughters, his wife, and they are dragging him out of town. They finally say, our hands are tied until we've got you clear of the blast zone. We've got a job to do, and we can't do it as long as you're here. And there's urgency about this. And then God's grace and God makes an astounding concession at this point, and this is almost funny. Lot says to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? Then my life will be saved." He said to them, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, and I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city is called Zoar, which literally means little. So, you just have to shake your head. God sent 2 angels to rescue Lot and his family. They've demonstrated already supernatural power. They struck the men of the city temporarily blind. They rescued Lot and his family. They've got him out of the city. And now Lot's having a panic attack. And he sounds like a little kid trying to negotiate 5 more minutes before bedtime. This is just a little city. Just let me stay here. It's like he is. It may be that Lot has so become identified as an urbanite, as a city person, that the idea of being cut loose out there in the wilderness without even a small village to identify with terrifies him. I don't know what's going on in his head. What we're hearing here is not the reasoning of a logical mind. And you get the impression that the angels just said, "Fine. Just park it here. Just get out of Sodom." One writer says, "Not even brimstone will make a pilgrim of him. He must have a little Sodom again in his life if it's to be supportable." There's no indication that Zoar's people were any more righteous than the Sodomites or the people in Gomorrah. But God spared Zoar because of righteous Lot, the one righteous man in town. And so what we have is the further answering of Abraham's prayer. Abraham's prayer reaches out and it protects Lot, and by default it protects Zoar. Sodom and Gomorrah were built in the great Rift Valley of the Jordan. If you know anything at all about geology, you may be aware of the fact that the Valley of the Jordan is part of the great rift that extends from modern-day Syria all the way down to Lake Victoria in Central Africa. It is a gigantic crack in the Earth's crust, the biggest such crack anywhere. At least there may be one under the ocean in the Pacific that would be comparable, but as far as one that you can actually see on the Earth's surface, it's unparalleled. It stretches for several thousand miles. The entire river Jordan runs in that crack. and most of it below sea level. The Dead Sea is the lowest elevation on the Earth's surface. It's over 1,000 feet below sea level. And that crack then continues down the Gulf of Aqaba, down the Red Sea. It hits the African mainland at the Horn of Africa. I've seen it at Djibouti, which is just north of Somalia, and then it goes on further inward in through Kenya, Tanzania. It's an amazing thing. When I flew from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to the capital of Djibouti, you could tell from the airplane 20,000 feet up when you hit the Rift Valley, because there's this series of cliffs and steep slopes where the Ethiopian highlands drop off down into that crack. It's incredibly dramatic sight from the air. It is a very unstable region geologically. There are earthquakes, there are volcanoes. In Djibouti, there's an area where the volcanoes are erupting almost constantly. It has been speculated, in terms of a naturalistic explanation of what happened here, that there were a series of earthquakes that 4,000 years ago, a quake opened up a fissure, releasing gases that ignited and setting sulfur and petroleum deposits aflame, which created a huge explosion which destroyed the cities. Now, that is very possible. The fact that God may use the forces of nature to fulfill His will and complete His promises in no way diminishes the reality of the promise. So whether this was some kind of geological episode related to the location of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Rift Valley, or whether God sent a meteor out of heaven, really doesn't matter. It certainly wouldn't matter if you lived in Sodom. You'd be just as dead. And then there is the story of Lot's wife. Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. As they were fleeing towards Zoar, Lot's wife stopped on the plain. Her backward look was more than just a glance. Now, we're not talking about magic here, folks. I shudder to think what Hollywood would do to this if they were trying to reproduce it. This is not a case of, they're going along and Lot's got her by the arm and kind of half dragging her, and she looks back and wham, she turns into salt. This is somebody whose heart never left Sodom. This was her hometown. This is where her father's family lived. This is where her would-be son-in-laws lived. This was not a place she wanted to leave. We're reminded of what Jesus says about the day of the Lord. On that day, let the one who's on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away, and likewise let the one who's in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Apparently she lost her life because of her reluctance to let go of her household stuff. In a word, she was a wife after Lot's own heart, but without any grace. The reality of what happened, she was, as this cataclysm is taking place, as she tarries, and I get my image is not of somebody right behind Lot, but somebody who's stopped dead in her tracks and is refusing to keep up, and Lot and the daughters and the angels are moving on, and the sulfurous gases and whatnot that are coming out of this thing, she succumb and is covered with the ash and the fallout of this cataclysm. And then there is the most poignant moment of the story. Go back to Abraham, up there on the ridgetop near Hebron, on that promontory where he can see all the way to the southern tip of the Dead Sea. Because, as I told you last week, there is a spot. You can stand there today and you can look and you can see the southern tip of the Dead Sea from that very place. And he got up early in the morning. You get the impression Abraham didn't get a lot of sleep that night. He'd had an incredible day, but his heart was troubled because his nephew was down there and he didn't know what was going to come, what was happening. And so he gets up and he goes out to that promontory as the sun is coming up over the hills on the other side of the Jordan. But there's something obscuring the early morning sunrise. It is the black sulfurous smoke that is billowing up from Sodom. And as Abraham stood there and stared, there's absolutely no reason for him to believe that his nephew was alive. In that moment, in Abraham's heart, he had to be thinking, I've lost my nephew. Which is a reminder. When you pray, there may come a point where you think God has refused to answer your prayer. Don't be presumptuous at that point. Because Abraham's prayer had been answered. At that point, he just didn't know it. And so it says, so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. A lot has been said and written about the desirability of finishing well. It dawned on me one day, before this year is up, I'll be old enough to start drawing out Social Security if I wanted to. I turned 62 in December. I can't believe I'm almost 62. I am a whole lot closer to the end of my public ministry than I am to the beginning of it. That started over 40 years ago, and no matter what kind of great gene pool I come from, it would be unreasonable to think I'm still going to be preaching in 40 years. So when you come to a point in life, at some point, if you're the least bit thoughtful, when you begin to reflect, I want to finish well. I want to go out doing what I need to be doing, what God's called me to be doing. I want to make my mark. However you want to phrase it. None of us want to just go out with a whimper. We don't want to just kind of drain like an empty pool. Well, Lot is a great example of finishing unwell. This is a life that deteriorates the longer it goes on. And the end of Lot's existence is awful any way you want to look at it. They made it to Zoar. The stench of burning sulfur was still heavy in the air. And after that pathetic episode of Lot begging the angels to spare Zoar, and a few verses later, he's having another panic attack. He's scared to death that Zoar is going to be next. And so he heads for the hills, literally. And again, on either side of that Rift Valley, there are steep, steep hills. You know, and when Jesus talked about the parable of the Good Samaritan, you know, he was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, and it is, you know, it's a drop in elevation of about 3,000 feet on a twisting, narrow road with hairpin turns through the desert. Well, it's about the same way going up on the other side, up toward Mount Nebo, where Moses stood before he died, and as he looked off into the promised land. It was up into those hills that Lot and his two daughters escaped to. And they moved into a cave. Consumed by fears, Lot becomes a cave dweller. He's a troglodyte at this point. One man put it this way: when a man is out of the will of God, he is haunted by the boogies of his own imagination. Lot has absolutely no rational basis for fearing that Zoar is going to be destroyed. In fact, he's got the promise of God's own angel that it would not be destroyed. But that doesn't quell his fears. And then there is the obvious answer to Lot's dilemma. Instead of heading east toward Mount Nebo, all he had to do was turn around and go west toward Hebron and his uncle. Why did they part company in the first place? Lot's herds had become so big that the land couldn't support both of them. Well, that problem has been neatly solved. His herds are all incinerated. Just Lot and his daughters. Now, how do you think Abraham would react and respond had Lot and his daughters, still stinking of smoke and brimstone, come dragging themselves up that ridge into Abraham's camp? Why? You know what he would have done. Abraham would have run out there like the father of the prodigal son. He would have grabbed him, he would have hugged him, he'd have killed the fatted calf. But for some reason, that's not what Lot did. Instead, he chose to live alone in a cave with his daughters. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps it was shame. We've probably all known circumstances where somebody's beloved family member has chosen to remain distant and alienated from people who love them because of shame. You know, I have so messed up, I just can't face my mom and dad again. Or I have so messed up, I can't face my brother. You know, that's a very real possibility, and it may be shame that kept Lot in the cave. It could have even been pride. You know, he left, when they parted company, you know, he was such a wealthy man that he and Abraham had to part company. You know, he left, again, like that prodigal son, with his share of the inheritance. And it can be really hard to swallow your pride and face the fact that I have utterly failed. For whatever reason. It could have been fear and depression that clouded his judgment. I mean, he has just been through a horrible, traumatic experience. And some, you know, we talk about post-traumatic stress. If there's ever a case of somebody who could rightly claim that, it would have been Lot. And under such circumstances, people make stupid choices sometimes. Whatever the reason, Lot's cave is more than a metaphor. He and his daughters lived in a dark, isolated, musty, dank hole in the ground. Both a physical and a spiritual cave. In fact, in the ancient world, caves were often tombs. A little bit later on, Abraham would buy a cave in order to bury his beloved wife. Spiritually entombed, Lot lived a degenerated, death-like existence. Now, even in light of what I said earlier about how the Canaanite world embraced homosexuality, no Near Eastern culture ever embraced incest. It was a universal taboo. It has almost always been a taboo in nearly every culture in human history. There are a few exceptions. The royal household of Pharaoh practiced incest. A few other such things. But they stand out because they are such rare exceptions. It's like long before we understood the realities of genetics, we had an instinctive understanding that this was not good. And so what happens to Lot and his daughters would have been abhorrent to anyone who'd known about it. In the code of Hammurabi, back in Mesopotamia, this was forbidden. In the Hittite laws, it was punishable by death or banishment. And yet that's what happens. And the motivation is not sensual. It's economic. These two daughters look at their situation and just say, we're really screwed here. We've got no home. We've got no dowry. We've got no prospects. We're living in the wilderness in a cave. Bear in mind, again, the whole basis on which women in the ancient world had personal value within the culture and for themselves. Their whole identity, their whole self-esteem was based on marriage and childbearing. Failing that was to fail in life. And they looked at their future, at their present circumstances, and they looked down the road at their likely future and they said, we have no hope. No man is going to marry us. We're not even going to meet him out here. And with that would come the failure to continue their family line. And so they did the unthinkable. They got their father drunk and seduced him. The phrase lie with may sound like an innocent euphemism, but typically when it's used in Scripture, it's to describe an illicit relationship or a situation of desperation. The biblical judgment on this is suggested in the fact that we don't even hear the names of these young women. It's like what they did is so unspeakable that let their name disappear from history. It's kind of like when Pharaoh, said, let in the old Ten Commandments movie, let the name of Moses be stricken from all the monuments. We don't even want to remember their names. Now this is a dark deed, and it took place in about the darkest place you could imagine, a cave at night. And so they got Lot drunk. But for this to have actually taken place, Lot was not passed out drunk. You know, he may not have understood what was going on. He certainly may not have been able to remember it the next morning. But he is not without blame in this. It's incidents like this that are the background of some of the Bible's later instructions about the use of alcohol. And even though I'm a Baptist preacher, I cannot tell you that the Bible condemns any use of alcohol. Total abstinence is not taught in Scripture. In fact, here's a little curious bit of trivia you can take home. In the church minutes of some old Kentucky Baptist churches in the hill country of eastern Kentucky from back in the early 1800s, it is noted in the minutes, the official minutes of the church business meeting, that the pastor was paid in corn liquor. That is a fact. That's church history. Now you put that in context, if you know anything about the history of Appalachia in the early 1800s, folded money or gold coins or anything like that was very scarce, hard to come by. And it was not unusual in some of those mountain villages to use distilled liquor like currency. It's a lot easier to move than truckloads of corn. So they turn the corn into liquor and they barter with the liquor. And so the reality is Baptists got into total abstinence with the temperance movement primarily in the post-Civil War years. And Baptists in other parts of the world, in many places, have never practiced total abstinence from alcohol. What we have always believed, and what the Bible clearly teaches, is real temperance, which is not total abstinence. It's to use in moderation. And the Bible is quite explicit about the sin of drunkenness. And what we see here with Lot and his daughters is a good example of why it's a bad idea to get drunk. Because you lose control of your faculties. Your decision-making processes are grossly impaired, and you may do stuff drunk that you would never do sober. Think about the irony. Through the prayers of Abraham, God's answer to those prayers, the exertion of two angels, God has taken Lot out of Sodom. And now, in this cave in the mountains, Sodom comes into Lot. It's gone full circle. And you got to wonder if Abraham realized what was going on, if he would have lived to regret that he even prayed for his being spared. Lot's descendants, through his incest with his daughters, became the beginnings of the Moabite and the Ammonite people. Now, once again, lest you get too hung up on your family history, bear in mind that it was a Moabite woman, a descendant ultimately of this incest, one Ruth, who was David's grandma. And David, from whom Jesus himself came. So the Lord and Savior of the universe had Lot and his daughter as the direct ancestor. We are not the prisoners of our family past. Not going to belabor it. In chapter 20, Abraham does the same dumb stunt that he did in Egypt with a different king, Abimelech. This one, a Philistine. You would think he. Every one of us has a weak point in our armor, a weak link in our chain. We have the sin that will tend to beset us over and over again. It's not the same sin, where your weak spot is and where mine is may be quite different. For some people, it's abusing alcohol or drugs. For some, it's greed. For some, it's lust. Nobody else necessarily knows what your weak link is. I guarantee you know what it is. It's that thing that you have struggled with all your life. It may be a tendency to procrastinate. It may be cowardice. Who knows what it is? Well, we can see where Abraham had a recurring problem. And it was a type of cowardice. A willingness to pass off his wife as his sister just to keep the pressure off when he was traveling in foreign parts. It was the tendency to trust himself and his own cleverness instead of God under such circumstances. The thing that is so striking about this situation is this Philistine king Abimelech comes out looking like the good guy in this story, and Abraham comes off looking like a fool. Abimelech is the one who acts righteously. But Abraham is protected by his covenant relationship with God, and God gets him out of the mess, even if it comes in the context of some embarrassment. And then finally, laughter comes. The name of Isaac. The promise was that by this time next year, you'll have a baby boy. And God kept his word to the letter. Imagine you've got this 100-year-old man and this 90-year-old woman. And one day, Sarah realizes she's pregnant. Now, you got to wonder what happened. I mean, it's pure speculation at this point. Does she try to keep it a secret for a while? Or does she immediately start shouting out loud? I guarantee you, a community lives in a few tents in close proximity. It's not a secret that she'd be able to successfully keep very long. Here is empirical, physical evidence that God keeps his promises. And everybody in that extended household is thrilled, with two exceptions: Hagar and Ishmael. 3 years pass. Isaac is a toddler. And Ishmael is about 16. Now, it could be a difficult situation had Ishmael and Isaac had the same father and the same mother. To be a 16-year-old boy with a 3-year-old brother can be a strain for a young teenage boy. We've probably all seen that, the rivalries. But this goes way beyond that, because Ishmael's mother is a slave. And everybody knows that Isaac is the favored one. So, the implication is that Ishmael is making fun of Isaac and giving him a hard time. Now, there's absolutely no basis to believe that he was physically hurting him. But he was ridiculing him. He was putting him down. And Sarah saw this, and she was not going to have any of it. And in an act of brutal harshness, she goes to Abraham and says, I want this woman and her kid out of our tent. Get rid of them. And Abraham's conflicted because this is his boy too. And this is a kid that he has raised from infancy to 16. He's taught him how to tend the herds. He's taught him how to hunt. He's taught him the things that a man needs to know. And at 16, he's a young man in that culture. And God helps him through it. He said, it's all right. I will take care of Ishmael. I will take care of Hagar. I will make of him many nations. Ishmael was a mistake made by Sarah and Abraham. He was not a part of God's plan for this family, and his presence was the source of ongoing conflict. It was a problem that only God was big enough to solve. And so they were sent away, and God intervened and spared them. We're out of time.